My mother called me a drug addict on a Thursday. Not to my face. That was never her style. Mrs. Renata Voss operated through intermediaries, through layered suggestion, through the carefully cultivated plausible deniability that 3 decades of country club politics had taught her to deploy like a scalpel. She told my Aunt Cecilia first, then let the current carry it where it would. By the following Sunday, my cousin Daphne had texted two of my childhood friends asking, with performative delicacy, whether they had noticed anything concerning about Cassidy lately. My name is Cassidy Elaine Voss. I was 31 years old when my family decided I had ceased to be a person and had become instead a story. I did not unravel when I found out. I did not call anyone crying. I set my phone face down on the desk in my rented apartment in Zurich, pressed two fingers against the inside of my left wrist the way I always do when I need to feel my own pulse. And I observed, with something approaching clinical interest, that my mother had made the single most consequential miscalculation of her entire life. She just did not know it yet. I want to pause here for a moment because if you have ever sat in a room, or read a text message, or answered a phone call, where your own blood relatives treated you like an inconvenient stranger, like a narrative problem to be managed rather than a human being to be known, then you already understand something essential about what I am going to tell you. You understand the particular quality of that silence inside yourself, not the loud silence of shock. The quiet, calibrated silence of someone who has decided, at a very specific molecular level, that they are done explaining themselves to people who have already decided what they believe. That silence is not weakness. That silence is load bearing infrastructure. If this story resonates with you, stay with me through every part of it. The architecture of what I built over the next 2 years. Quietly, invisibly, 12 time zones away from the people who were busy narrating my destruction, is something I have never fully laid out in sequence before. There are details in what I am about to share that my own attorney, a meticulous woman named Reginald Harriet Cho, who charges $475 per hour, and has never once in 6 years of professional association expressed an emotion I could identify, has described as, and I am quoting her precisely here, unusually thorough documentation for a private individual. I will take that as the compliment I believe it was intended to be. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare started. The Voss estate sits on approximately 4.5 acres in Westchester County, New York. It is the kind of property that announces itself before you arrive, through a wrought iron gate my grandfather commissioned in 1972, through a gravel driveway long enough that you have time to adjust your posture twice before reaching the front door. The house itself is colonial revival, cream-colored, with black shutters that my mother has had repainted every 3 years for as long as I can remember, because she believes, and has stated this belief aloud, that faded shutters signal a family in decline. I grew up understanding that the appearance of things was not vanity in the Voss household. It was strategy. I was the second of 3 children. My brother Prescott is 4 years older than me and has functioned, since approximately the age of 14, as the designated inheritor of every expectation my father ever had about what a Voss was supposed to produce in the world. My sister Lydia is 3 years younger than me and has functioned, with equal precision, as the designated inheritor of every aspiration my mother ever had about what a Voss woman was supposed to look like performing happiness. I occupied the middle position, which in families like ours is not a neutral space. It is a contested one. I was the variable they had not fully accounted for. Through my childhood and into my early 20s, I dressed the way the household budget for the younger girl allowed me to dress, which is to say, practically. Not poorly. The Voss name carried enough ambient expectation that true shabbiness was not permitted. But while Lydia received the cashmere, I received the cotton. While Prescott received the tailored blazers for his high school debate competitions, I received the sensible department store separates that my mother selected with the focused efficiency of someone checking a box. There was nothing cruel in the overt sense about any of this. The cruelty was architectural. It was built into the structure of how resources moved in that house, quietly and without announcement, the way water finds the path of least resistance. I noticed. I always noticed. I simply did not say anything, because I had understood from a young age that naming the architecture of a thing gives the architects the opportunity to deny it, and I preferred to know the truth than to exchange it for a denial. My father, Mr. Harlan Voss, was not a cruel man by nature. He was an absent one, which in certain family systems produces the same outcomes. He ran a mid-sized private equity operation in Midtown Manhattan, managed a portfolio that my mother referenced at dinner parties with the specific pride of someone who has decided that proximity to financial power constitutes a form of personal achievement. He worked. He traveled. He deferred on matters of the household's interior social life almost entirely to my mother. This was, I came to understand, not laziness. It was a negotiated arrangement. She managed the family's presentation to the world. He provided the resources that made the presentation possible. They had built something efficient together, even if efficiency was not the word either of them would have chosen to describe it. The one person in that household who operated outside of this arrangement was my mother's youngest brother, my Uncle Theodore, who arrived at family gatherings in a 15-year-old Volvo with a cracked dashboard and opinions about monetary policy that he would share, unprompted, at considerable length, with anyone who failed to escape to the other side of the room in time. The family's assessment of Uncle Theodore was consistent and largely unkind. My mother referred to him as well-meaning in the particular tone she reserved for things she found embarrassing. Prescott called him the cautionary tale, which I always thought revealed more about Prescott than it did about Theodore. The general consensus was that Theodore had been given the same foundational advantages as everyone else in the Voss lineage and had squandered them through a combination of poor professional judgment and an inability to stop telling the truth in rooms where the truth was not wanted. I adored him. Theodore had spent 11 years working in international financial compliance before burning out completely and spending 3 years, at what I gathered was considerable personal financial cost, sailing a second-hand catamaran around the eastern Mediterranean. He came back with a deep tan, a working knowledge of maritime law in 4 jurisdictions, and an absolute inability to participate in social performance of any kind. He could no longer pretend to find things interesting that were not interesting. He could no longer soften assessments to protect the feelings of people he believed were operating in bad faith. The family found this pathological. I found it clarifying. It was Theodore who, when I was 24 years old and sitting on the back steps of the Westchester estate after a dinner during which my father had announced that Prescott was being given a funded seat at my father's firm, while I had not been offered so much as an informational conversation, sat down next to me with 2 glasses of a Spanish red wine. A Ribera del Duero that he had brought himself because he had correctly predicted that the wine my parents served at these events would be theatrical rather than good, handed me 1 glass, and said without preamble, "You know they're not going to fund you." "I know," I said. "It's not about your capability," he said. "You understand that." "I understand that." He turned the glass in his hand, watching the wine move. "Then the question is what you're going to do about it." I did not answer him that night, but I kept the question. The Ribera del Duero was a 2017 vintage, a Pesca Crianza, and the bottle cost $43.72, which I know because Theodore handed me the receipt later that evening, folded into a small square and said, "Keep that. Someday you'll want to remember what good taste looks like when it doesn't have an audience." I slipped it into the inside pocket of the gray merino wool cardigan I was wearing, the sensible department store kind, and I did not throw it away. I have it still. Over the following 4 years, I built a career in consulting, which is to say, I built one in the only way available to someone who is not going to receive a funded seat at a family firm, through the grinding accumulation of credibility in rooms where I had no inherited standing. I worked with a startup advisory group based in Boston, then moved to a boutique strategy firm in New York, then began taking international engagements that kept me on planes more often than not. I was good at the work. I was better than good. I had a particular skill for identifying the structural inefficiencies in organizations that had mistaken their own internal mythology for operational reality, which is perhaps not a coincidence given where I had learned to read institutional behavior. My compensation during these years was real but not spectacular. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens. I drove a 4-year-old Honda that I maintained with religious consistency because I could not afford for it to fail. I wore good shoes because I had learned from watching my mother that shoes communicate, and because good leather holds its credibility over time in a way that fast fashion does not. But the rest of my wardrobe during those years was functional, muted, chosen for longevity rather than impression. The Voss estate events required a certain baseline, so I kept 2 blazers that could be cycled through family occasions without generating comment. Neither of them were remarkable. That was the point. The family noticed my career progress the way you notice background music, which is to say, intermittently and without real attention. Prescott, who had been given his funded seat and had proceeded to produce moderate, unremarkable results with it over several years, referred to my consulting work as freelancing, a word he used with the specific inflection of someone who considers a regular paycheck to be a moral achievement. My mother asked at least twice per year whether I was still doing the travel thing, as though international client engagements were a phase I would eventually grow out of, like a gap year or a difficult haircut. My father said less. But occasionally, across a dinner table or in a brief hallway exchange, I caught him watching me with an expression I did not entirely know how to read. Not pride exactly, something more complicated, something that looked, in certain lights, like the early stages of a recalibration. I did not hold on to that observation too tightly. I had learned not to. Then, approximately 22 months before my face appeared on the cover of Forbes magazine, I received a contact through a professional network connection that would change the direction of everything. A venture-backed technology company, operating in advanced supply chain infrastructure, was looking for a founding strategy consultant for a significant international expansion. The project required complete operational discretion. Investor agreements included non-disclosure provisions that were, by the standards I was accustomed to reviewing, unusually comprehensive. The engagement was based in Zurich, with satellite operations in Singapore and Toronto. The compensation structure included a base retainer plus an equity participation clause. The equity participation clause was the part I did not discuss with anyone in my family. The base retainer, for a 24-month engagement, was $187,000 per year. That number is precise, and I am stating it precisely because it will matter later. I told my parents in the way you tell people things when you know they are not really listening, which is directly and without softening. I flew home for what I had described as a brief visit. We sat in the estate dining room with its heavy cream drapes and its sideboard loaded with objects my mother had collected over 30 years of deliberate aesthetic self-construction, and I laid out the opportunity, the overseas posting, the strategic role, the confidentiality requirements, the duration. My father nodded the way he nodded at things that did not require his immediate engagement. My mother's face shifted into that particular blankness I had catalogued over 3 decades of careful observation. Not confusion, not concern, something more like a woman mentally sorting a problem into an existing category that had already been prepared for it. She said, "So we won't be hearing from you." It was not a question. "The NDA provisions are strict," I said. "Limited personal communication. I'll check in when I can." She nodded. She lifted her water glass. She said, "Well, we'll explain it to the family." I did not ask her how she intended to explain it. I should have asked. But I had underestimated, in that moment, the creativity available to a woman who had spent 30 years managing the Voss family's presentation to the world, and who had, on some level I was only beginning to fully map, never forgiven me for being a variable she could not fully control. I flew to Zurich 6 days later. The lie, as I would eventually reconstruct it through secondary sources, metastasized quickly. The first version, as relayed to my Aunt Cecilia, was that I had gotten into some trouble and was getting help. The second version, refined for the country club circuit, was that I was in a residential treatment facility, out west, which was geographically vague enough to be unverifiable and specific enough to be vivid. The third version, deployed to the extended family network in a coordinated wave that suggested prior planning rather than improvised damage control, was explicit. Drug addiction, a prolonged struggle. The family was handling it compassionately and privately, which is a phrase my mother uses to signal that a topic is closed. The physical letters from Aunt Cecilia arrived in Queens, to my empty apartment, forwarded eventually to my attorney's office address, which was the only domestic contact I had left active. Reginald Harriet Cho collected them in a manila folder without comment and sent me scanned copies. Aunt Cecilia's handwriting is large and slopes significantly to the right, the kind of script that suggests a person who was taught penmanship as a child and has spent decades performing it for an audience. The letters expressed, in 17 pages across 4 separate mailings, unconditional love, concern, the importance of family during dark times, and a recommendation for a meditation retreat in Sedona, Arizona. I reviewed every page. I noted the dates. I noted the postmarks. I noted the specific phrasing because certain phrases, when you encounter them in legal contexts later, have weight. I was in Zurich. I was working 17-hour cycles. I was building something. The project was real and it was difficult and it was the most demanding professional engagement of my life, which is saying something. The team I was embedded with was 11 people across 3 time zones. and my role was to hold the strategic architecture coherent across all of them, while the founders managed investor relations and product development. I was good at it. I was consistently, documentably good at it, and the documentation was meticulous because I had decided early in my professional life that meticulous documentation is the only form of self protection that does not require you to trust anyone else. On my desk in the Zurich apartment, which was a furnished rental in the Seefeld district with pale oak floors and a window that looked out over a narrow canal, I kept three objects that had traveled with me from New York. The first was Theodore's wine receipt, the Pescara Crianza, $43.72, still folded in the same small square. The second was a navy fountain pen, a Mont Blanc Meisterstück 149 with a medium nib, that I had purchased myself the week I signed my first consulting contract in Boston, using the first paycheck I had received in my professional life, because I had decided that I was going to sign every significant document in my career with something that was entirely mine. The third was a framed photograph, 5 inches by 7 inches in a simple brushed aluminum frame, of Theodore and me sitting on the back steps of the Westchester estate on the night he handed me the wine, taken by nobody because nobody else had been there, which I know sounds contradictory, except that Theodore had propped his phone against a planter and set a timer because he said he had a feeling, and Theodore's feelings had a documented accuracy rate I had learned to respect. I worked. I did not post on social media. I did not call home. I checked in with Theodore twice per month through a messaging application he had downloaded at my specific request, and our communications were brief and professional, coded in the mild, plausible language of two people discussing travel itineraries. He knew what was happening at home. He was watching it from a closer distance than I was, and he was, in his way, keeping notes of his own. It was in the 14th month of my Zurich engagement, on a Tuesday evening when I had just come off a 12-hour strategy session and was reviewing expense documentation for a quarterly investor report, that I accessed a domestic financial account I maintained in New York, a legacy account I had kept open because it received a small residual payment from an old engagement, and I noticed something that took me several seconds to fully process. There was a withdrawal I had not made. The amount was not dramatic, $422.16. The merchant code attached to it was one I did not immediately recognize. I sat with it for a moment in the way I sit with things that do not make immediate sense, which is quietly, without moving, with the specific stillness of someone who has trained herself not to react until she understands what she is reacting to. I opened a separate browser window. I looked up the merchant code. It routed to a legal services firm in Westchester County, New York. I did not close the browser. I did not call anyone. I did not send a message to Theodore. I sat at my pale oak desk with the canal outside my window reflecting the last pale light of a Swiss evening, and I opened a new document on my laptop and I began to type. Date, amount, merchant code, account accessed. Method of access, which I would need to confirm through my bank's transaction detail records, which I requested through the bank's secure portal within the same hour. I noted the time of the request. I noted the response timeline. I noted everything in the precise, clinical language of someone who has decided that this document is going to matter one day and who intends to make it unimpeachable. By the time the bank's detail records arrived, 4 days later, I had already contacted Reginald Harriet Cho. Her response was 3 sentences. Forward everything you have. Do not access that account again until I have reviewed it. Do not discuss this with anyone in your family. I replied, understood. I forwarded everything I had. Then I went back to work because the company I was helping build was in a critical phase, and because I had learned, over 31 years of being Cassidy Elaine Voss, that the most powerful thing you can do when someone has underestimated you is to continue, without interruption, being exactly as formidable as you actually are. The account access was not an accident, and it was not the first time. Reginald Harriet Cho had a rule about phone calls. She did not make them when emails would suffice, and she did not make them when she had nothing definitive to report, and she did not make them, under any circumstances, before she had reviewed every document in a file at least twice. So when my phone rang on a Thursday morning in Zurich, 4 weeks after I had forwarded the account access records, and her name appeared on the screen, I set down the Mont Blanc Meisterstück and I answered on the second ring. The merchant code, she said without greeting, routes to a firm called Hargrove and DeLacy, a civil estate planning practice in Scarsdale, New York. They have been retained, according to the records I've now pulled, for approximately 11 months. I did not say anything. The account access, she continued, was executed using a routing credential that was not generated by you. Someone used a secondary authorization token, which means someone had access to credentials you did not knowingly share. I want you to think carefully before you answer my next question. I'm thinking, I said. Have you ever given your father signatory access to that account? I had. 7 years earlier, briefly, during a period when I was traveling for an extended engagement and had needed someone to receive and forward a paper check that a client was sending by mail. I had added him as a limited signatory, a temporary measure, and I had intended to remove it when I returned. I had forgotten. I had been 25 years old and I had not yet developed the habit of auditing my own financial infrastructure with the regularity that I now apply to it. Yes, I said. A long time ago, I didn't remove it. 3 seconds of silence on her end. For Reginald Harriet Cho, 3 seconds of silence is the professional equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. I need you to send me every account document you have, she said. Every statement, every authorization record, going back as far as you have access to. I also need you to not make any changes to the account until I instruct you to. I understand. One more thing, Cassidy. She used my first name approximately 3 times per year, and each instance carried the specific weight of something she wanted me to register. The firm they've retained specializes in contested asset structures. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understood exactly what she was telling me. I ended the call. I sat at the pale oak desk and I looked at the canal for a long time without seeing it. Then I opened my documentation file, added 3 new entries with the precision of someone who has decided to treat their own life as a case study, and I sent Reginald Harriet Cho everything she had asked for before noon. Then I sent Theodore a message that read, in its entirety, I need to talk, not the usual channel. Call me when you're somewhere private. He called me 40 minutes later. He was in the parking structure of a supermarket in White Plains, New York, which he described as sufficiently cinematic for the occasion. Tell me what you know, I said. What he knew was more than I had anticipated, and less than I would eventually need, but it was enough to confirm the shape of what was happening. He had been watching the estate's social patterns for months, not with any formal intent, but with the specific, practiced attentiveness of a man who had spent 11 years in financial compliance and had never fully unlearned the habit of noticing when things did not add up. He had observed that my mother had begun hosting a particular category of meeting at the estate, small groups of 2 or 3 people, arriving in the early afternoon on weekdays, staying for 1 to 2 hours, departing without the social fanfare that typically accompanied Voss estate visits. He had seen my father's car absent from the property on 3 consecutive Saturdays, which was unusual given that my father treated weekends at the estate as a near religious observance. He had overheard, at a family gathering 3 months prior, a conversation between Prescott and my mother that had stopped when he entered the room, which he described as not subtle. What were they saying? I asked. Prescott said, she's not going to know until it's done. Your mother said, that's the point. I did not react. I pressed 2 fingers against the inside of my left wrist, counted my own pulse to 4, and noted, with the portion of my mind that had become increasingly clinical over the preceding weeks, that what I was experiencing was not surprise. It was confirmation. There is a specific cold relief in confirmation that people who have never been gaslit by people they love do not fully understand. The uncertainty is the unbearable part. The certainty, even when it is terrible, gives you something to work with. Theodore, I said, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without discussing it with anyone in the family, and I need you to understand that when this is over, I will explain everything. I know, he said. I've been waiting for you to ask. I told him what I needed. He said he would begin immediately. I told him to be careful. He said, in the specific dry tone that I have loved about him since I was 8 years old, that he had spent 3 years sailing a second-hand catamaran through the Eastern Mediterranean and had survived an unscheduled overnight anchorage outside of Dubrovnik during an unseasonable storm, and he believed he could manage a Westchester County records search without incident. I said, I know you can. I went back to work. The company was entering its most critical phase, a market expansion push that required strategic documentation I had been building for 6 weeks, and I completed it on schedule because I was not going to allow what was happening at home to compromise what I was building overseas. I had made that decision early, and I held to it with the same consistency I applied to everything I decided to hold to, which is to say, absolutely. The Forbes contact came 8 weeks after my conversation with Theodore. A senior editor named Paulette Drismore reached out through my professional network with the kind of message that is carefully casual and unmistakably serious, expressing interest in the company's expansion, narrative, and specifically in my role as the founding strategy architect. The company's investors had already been approached, and had given preliminary approval for a profile, which was standard for a publication at that level. The editorial team wanted 6 to 8 weeks to develop the piece. The cover was, at that stage, a possibility rather than a certainty. I spoke with the company's investor relations lead before responding. I reviewed the non disclosure provisions in my contract with the company's legal team, a thorough process that took 4 days and resulted in a 12-page clearance memo. I confirmed with Reginald Harriet Cho that there were no legal reasons, given the ongoing documentation process she was managing on my behalf, to avoid public profile at that time. She reviewed everything and responded with 2 words: proceed carefully. I responded to Paulette Drismore and agreed to the process. The photo shoot was scheduled for a Tuesday in Manhattan. I purchased, for the first time in my adult professional life, a blazer that was not chosen for longevity or invisibility. It was a structured blazer in dark emerald, almost forest green, with a silhouette that was architectural rather than decorative, the kind of garment that does not ask permission from the room it enters. I wore it with a simple pendant necklace in brushed gold, a piece I had bought myself in Zurich from a jeweler in the Altstadt district, small and specific and entirely mine. I wore my hair back. I did not wear anything that belonged to the Voss family aesthetic or the Voss family story. The photographer was a woman named Sujin Park, who had been shooting Forbes covers for 11 years, and who told me, during a brief break between setups, that the subjects who photographed best were never the ones trying to look powerful. The ones who photograph, she said, placing the word with precision, are the ones who already know something the camera doesn't yet. I thought about Theodore's folded receipt in my desk drawer in Zurich, $43.72, the Pescara Cryenza. The back steps of the estate. I gave Sujin Park the look she was looking for. The Voss family's annual late summer gathering, which my mother referred to as a family dinner, in the same way that a coronation ceremony might be referred to as a small get-together, was held in the third week of August at the Westchester estate. It had been scheduled for weeks before the Forbes publication date, which fell on a Tuesday, and the magazine hit newsstands and digital distribution simultaneously on that Tuesday morning, which was 11 days before the family dinner. I knew this. I had known the publication timeline for 6 weeks. My mother did not know this, neither did Prescott. Neither did my father, who was more passive participant than active architect in what was happening, but who had allowed it, which is its own category of culpability that I had discussed at length with Reginald Harriet Cho. I flew back from Zurich 4 days before the dinner. I stayed at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan rather than at the estate, which I had done before on return visits and which my mother had categorized, in communications with Aunt Cecilia, as evidence of my distance from the family, a characterization that I had, by this point, documented along with everything else. The Forbes issue hit on Tuesday. I was in my hotel room when the digital edition went live. I reviewed my own profile with the specific, somewhat surreal experience of reading something true about yourself written by someone else, someone who had assembled the facts correctly and presented them in a sequence that was both accurate and more coherent than lived experience usually feels from the inside. There was a photograph, the emerald blazer, the pendant. The look that Sujin Park had coaxed from whatever quiet, certain place I had been living in for 2 years. My phone received its first forwarded message from Theodore at 11:47 in the morning. It was a screenshot of a text he had received from my Aunt Cecilia, which read in full, "Theodore, have you seen this? About Cassidy? What is happening?" I did not respond. I made a note of the timestamp. The calls to my mother's phone, according to what Theodore was able to observe over the following days, began within the hour. Family, friends, professional contacts, people who had been told, in careful and compassionate language, that Cassidy Voss was in a treatment facility somewhere west of the Mississippi, were now holding a major business publication with Cassidy Voss's face on the cover and a subtitle describing her as a founding strategy architect of one of the year's most significant supply chain technology expansions. The cognitive distance between those two narratives was not bridgeable. There was no version of the story in which both things were true. And my mother, who had spent 3 decades building and maintaining the Voss family narrative with the focused, systematic dedication of a professional, was now facing the specific catastrophe of a constructed fiction colliding with documented, printed, institutionally verified reality. I gave her 11 days to sit with that. Then I drove to Westchester for the family dinner. The estate in late August holds a particular quality of light that I have never experienced anywhere else, a specific warm density that comes from the mature oak trees along the western property line, filtering the late afternoon sun into something amber and almost ceremonial. I had grown up with that light. I had stopped finding it beautiful sometime in my early 20s, when I had begun to understand that beautiful settings can house ugly dynamics without any aesthetic contradiction at all. But arriving that Tuesday evening, I noticed it again, and I noticed it the way you notice things when you have decided that you are going to remember everything about a specific occasion. I wore the dark emerald blazer, the pendant, my own shoes, dark leather, the ones I had bought with my own money from my own professional life, worn enough to be credible and maintained enough to communicate everything I needed them to communicate. I had nothing borrowed from the Voss family aesthetic. I was dressed entirely in my own story. I parked in the gravel drive behind Aunt Cecilia's sedan and Prescott's company leased vehicle, which he had upgraded 6 months prior to a black luxury model that he had mentioned twice at previous gatherings, unprompted. I sat in my rental car for 47 seconds, not composing myself. I did not need to compose myself. I was simply observing the house, its cream-colored facade and its freshly painted black shutters, and allowing myself to understand, with full clarity, exactly where I was and exactly why I was there. Then I got out of the car and walked through the front door. The entrance hallway of the Voss estate has a chandelier my grandmother brought from an auction in Connecticut in 1981, a piece in hand-cut crystal that my mother keeps polished to a standard that I have always considered slightly excessive given that no one looks up at it. I looked up at it that evening. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I walked toward the sound of voices from the dining room. The gathering was larger than I had anticipated. Beyond the immediate family, my mother had invited what I would have estimated as 14 to 16 extended family members and close family friends, the specific category of guest whose presence serves a dual social function: witness and audience. The dining room table, which seats 20 when fully extended, was fully extended. The sideboard was loaded with the same objects I had cataloged over 3 decades: the decorative silver, the collected ceramics, the framed photographs arranged with the deliberate asymmetry that my mother had once described as curated rather than staged, a distinction I had never been able to map onto any observable difference. My mother was standing near the sideboard when I entered. She was wearing an ivory silk blouse and a structured skirt in champagne, her jewelry coordinated with the specific overprecision of someone who had planned this outfit well, in advance of any particular occasion. She saw me enter. Her face did what I had been cataloging for 31 years, the particular blankness that was not blankness at all but rapid, invisible processing. She crossed the room and kissed my cheek in the continental manner she had adopted sometime in my late childhood from a friend who had married a European and which she had never fully abandoned. "Cassidy," she said, "you look well." "Thank you," I said, "the blazer is new." She assessed the blazer in a single, comprehensive glance and said nothing further about it, which told me everything about how she had processed the Forbes cover, because my mother's default response to evidence of my success had always been a specific, controlled silence rather than acknowledgement. Aunt Cecilia embraced me near the doorway with the fervor of someone who had recently been embarrassed and was hoping enthusiasm might retroactively cover it. She was wearing a floral wrap dress in a coral print, and her hair had been done recently, the kind of fresh salon wave that signals a special occasion. She held my arms and looked at my face with an expression that was attempting to be warm and was achieving something more like cautious. "You look absolutely wonderful," she said. "We are just so relieved, Cassidy." So relieved. I did not ask her what she was relieved about. I smiled in the way I have practiced since I was approximately 14 years old, a smile that is complete and warm and communicates nothing about what I am thinking, and I moved further into the room. Prescott was standing near the bar cart my father had purchased at an estate auction in Greenwich, a piece in dark walnut with brass fittings that he had mentioned, also twice, at previous gatherings. Prescott was wearing a blazer in charcoal with a white shirt, no tie, the deliberately casual formality of a man who wants to signal both success and approachability simultaneously, and achieves neither with full conviction. He was taller than me by 4 inches, and had always used that 4 inches as a form of low-grade architectural dominance in conversations, positioning himself slightly above and angled downward in a way that was almost certainly not conscious and was nonetheless consistent. He handed me a glass of sparkling water without asking whether I wanted it, which was his standard operating procedure with me since approximately the age of 19. "Cass," he said, "long flight?" "Not terrible," I said. "You look tired," he said. He said this every time I saw him. In 22 years of adult sibling interaction, he had said it, at minimum, once per encounter. I had stopped responding to it years ago. Lydia, my younger sister, was across the room in conversation with two of the family friends, wearing a pale blue dress that was almost certainly from the same designer my mother used, and which had cost, based on my knowledge of that designer's current pricing, somewhere between $1,200 and $1,600. Lydia dressed with my mother's aesthetic and had done so since she was old enough to make deliberate choices about clothing. She caught my eye from across the room and gave me a wave that was genuine and brief, because Lydia's feelings about me were complicated in ways that were at least honest, which I appreciated more than I would have if they had been simple and performed. The dinner was announced at 7:40 in the evening. We sat. My mother placed me, I noted, in the middle of the table's long side, which was the seat with the least visual prominence. She placed Prescott at the head, which was my father's traditional seat, and my father at the other head. She placed herself at the pivot point where the table's social geography centered, which she had been doing since I was a child, and which gave her, from that position, visual access to every face at the table simultaneously. The first courses were served. The conversation moved through its expected registers: summer travel, property values in the county, the comparative performance of various social acquaintances' children. The latter topic deployed with the competitive subtlety of people who have decided that their children's achievements are a contact sport while maintaining the surface affect of parental pride. It was during the main course, approximately 40 minutes into dinner, that my mother set her fork down. I noticed the fork. A small, deliberate placement, the tines down, the handle at a precise angle, the particular gesture of someone about to redirect a room. I had seen it before. I had seen it deployed at least a dozen times across my lifetime at tables like this one, and I knew what it preceded. I set my own fork down. I folded my hands in my lap. I pressed once lightly, two fingers against the inside of my left wrist. "I want to say something," my mother said to the table, in the specific pitch she used when she wanted a room's full attention and was confident she already had it, "about the past 2 years." The table quieted. 14 people finding the particular attentiveness of guests who understand that something has been staged for them. "As many of you know," she continued, "our family has been through something very private and very difficult. We made choices as a family to handle that difficulty the way we handle everything, together, discreetly, and with love." She paused. "Cassidy is back with us tonight, looking well, and I think it is time that we acknowledge what she has come through." Aunt Cecilia, at the far end of the table, pressed her hand to her chest in a gesture that was wholly sincere in its sentimentality and wholly unaware of its grotesqueness. "We are so proud of your recovery," my mother said, looking at me with an expression of curated warmth. "It takes enormous courage to face what you faced." I looked at my mother. I held her gaze with the steady, unreadable quality I had been developing for 31 years. I did not speak. It was Prescott who stepped into the silence. Prescott had always had difficulty with silences that he had not created. "Cass," he said from his end of the table, with the avuncular authority of someone who has appointed himself the family's reasonable voice, "no one is judging you. That's the thing. Everyone at this table loves you. The rehab was the right call. We should have said that more clearly at the time." A family friend, a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Price, who had known my mother for 25 years, and who was wearing a dress in deep burgundy with a pearl choker that she touched periodically, as though verifying its continued presence, nodded with the solemn affirmation of someone deeply invested in a story she had not originated but had thoroughly adopted. "You were very brave," Mrs. Price said to me directly, in the tone of voice reserved for people who are being acknowledged for surviving something shameful. My father, at the far head of the table, looked at his plate. Then my mother reached across and placed her hand over mine where it rested on the table, a gesture of such practiced maternal tenderness that I believe, in that moment, she had fully convinced herself it was real. "We told everyone," she said, with the quiet, level certainty of someone finalizing a record, "that you were a drug addict. We had to. You left. You gave us nothing to work with. What were we supposed to tell people?" A breath. "We did what we had to do to protect this family's dignity, and I make no apologies for it." I did not pull my hand away. I did not lean back. I did not do any of the visible, legible things that the room was perhaps bracing for. The push back, the voice raised, the chair scraped against hardwood in the specific register of someone leaving a table in anger. I looked at my mother's hand over mine. I observed the rings she wore, the Voss family diamond on her right hand and her own engagement ring on her left, both polished with the same excessive consistency as the chandelier in the hallway. I observed the slight tension in her wrist, a tension she was not aware of, the kind that lives beneath the performance of certainty and reveals the thing the performance is trying to cover. I lifted my water glass with my other hand. I took one slow drink, I set it back down. I appreciate you sharing that, I said, nothing else, 4 words completely level. The table's social weather shifted in the 2 seconds after I said them. Not dramatically, not with any of the visible markers that would give the room something to process and report, but in the specific, atmospheric way that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realizes that the person they expected to be the most affected is the least affected person present. Prescott cleared his throat. Mrs. Price touched her pearls. Aunt Cecilia looked at her plate. My mother held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she picked up her fork. She resumed the performance. The table, taking its cue, resumed with her. I ate the remainder of my dinner. I participated, briefly and pleasantly, in a conversation about a local cultural event that Lydia raised deliberately, I believe, as an act of low-grade mercy. I thanked the staff who cleared the plates. I accepted a small dessert that I did not finish. And at 8:53 in the evening, I excused myself from the table with the specific, unremarkable social language of someone who needs a breath of air and will return shortly. And I walked through the estate's hallway, past the chandelier, through the heavy front door, and out into the amber-washed late summer evening, where my rental car was parked behind Prescott's least luxury vehicle in the gravel drive. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. I did not cry. I did not allow myself any external expression of the thing that was moving through me, the compressed, tectonic weight of sitting at that table, and being named, publicly, by the woman who raised me, as the thing she had invented to protect herself. I pressed my fingers against my wrist and I counted and I breathed and I let the feeling be exactly what it was without giving it anywhere to go that could be observed or weaponized or used. Then I took out my phone. I called Theodore. He answered on the first ring. He did not say hello. He said, "How bad was it?" She said it out loud, I said, at the table in front of everyone. A pause. Then it's documented. I need you to send everything you have to Reginald tonight. Everything. The parking structure conversations, the estate visitor logs you've been keeping, the overheard exchange with Prescott, all of it. It's already packaged, he said. I've been ready for 3 weeks. I closed my eyes briefly. Theodore, the family's cautionary tale, in his 15-year-old Volvo with the cracked dashboard, who had handed me a bottle of wine on a back porch step and told me to keep the receipt, had been ready for 3 weeks. Send it, I said. Sending now, he said. I watched the house through the windshield. The dining room windows glowed amber from inside. The chandelier light refracted through the crystal my grandmother had brought from Connecticut in 1981. The black shutters freshly painted against a cream facade. The whole deliberate, maintained architecture of a family that had confused appearance with reality for so long that the distinction had become, for them, genuinely invisible. I called Reginald Harriet Cho. It was 9:14 in the evening, a time at which she had told me explicitly that she preferred not to receive calls, a preference I had respected for 6 years without exception. She answered on the second ring. She said it at the table, I said, publicly, 14 witnesses minimum. I can give you names, relationships, and approximate seating positions. A silence that was not a pause but an assessment. Give me the names, she said. I gave her the names. I gave her Mrs. Dorothea Price, with the burgundy dress and the pearl choker, who had called me brave in front of 11 people for surviving a fabricated addiction. I gave her Aunt Cecilia, 4 physical letters and counting, return address documented, postmarks preserved. I gave her the family friends, their full names to the extent I knew them, their relationships to my mother, their apparent social investment in the narrative they had been sold. The account access documentation, Reginald said. I want to move forward on that concurrently. Move forward, I said. Hargrove and DeLacy engagement, she continued. Theodore's materials, once I've reviewed them, may change the legal character of what I'm looking at significantly. I understand. One more thing. The first name frequency was now twice in a single conversation, which was a record. The Forbes article, the documentation of your professional activities over the full engagement period, the compensation records, including the equity participation clause. I need certified copies of everything. You'll have them by Monday. She said she would begin drafting on Tuesday. I ended the call. I sat in the gravel driveway of the Voss estate for 4 more minutes. The dining room windows continued to glow. I could see the silhouette of my mother moving near the sideboard, the confident movement of a woman who had managed the evening's performance to her satisfaction, who had named her own daughter's fictional disgrace at a dinner table, and believed, in the specific way that people believe things when no one has yet told them otherwise, that the story still belonged to her. I started the engine. I pulled out of the gravel drive without drama. I drove back toward Manhattan through the late summer dark, past the wrought iron gate my grandfather commissioned in 1972, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. The Mont Blanc Meisterstück, in its case on the hotel room desk where I would return to it that night, was already uncapped, and the document Reginald Harriet Cho had begun drafting would require, before it was filed, my signature in ink that was entirely, permanently, and on the formal record my own. They raised their glasses inside that amber room to a version of me that had never existed, and every word of that toast was going into evidence. Reginald Harriet Cho did not use the word fraud on our first call after she had reviewed Theodore's materials. She used it on the third. The first call, which came on a Wednesday morning 11 days after the estate dinner, was 42 minutes long and covered what she described as the preliminary architecture of the situation, which was her language for the period before she had decided what she was looking at. The second call, 4 days later, covered what she described as several areas requiring clarification, which was her language for the period when she knew exactly what she was looking at and was confirming it from secondary sources before she would allow herself to name it. The third call was 7 minutes long. She said the word once, in the middle of a sentence without emphasis, the way you use a word when you have been using it internally for days, and it has lost its shock value through repetition. The signature on the 2019 estate amendment, she said, is not your signature. I've had it reviewed by a forensic document examiner named Dr. Mara Velacourt, who holds a doctoral certification in question document examination from the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners and has provided expert testimony in 47 federal civil cases. Her assessment is unambiguous. The signature was produced by someone with access to a high-resolution scan of your actual signature and reproduced it using a method consistent with traced or projected transfer. It is not a freehand forgery. It is a meticulous one, which tells us something about the intent. I was sitting at the desk in my hotel room in Midtown Manhattan. I had extended my stay from the original 3-night booking to an open-ended arrangement because I had understood, after the estate dinner, that what was coming next was going to require proximity. I had the Mont Blanc uncapped. I was writing as she spoke, longhand, because there are things I need to feel the physical act of recording. Walk me through the amendment, I said. She walked me through it. The Voss family estate, the Westchester property and its associated real asset portfolio, had been held in a family trust since my grandfather's death in 1989. The trust had been structured with my grandmother as primary trustee, my father as successor trustee, and 3 grandchildren, Prescott, myself, and Lydia, named as equal beneficiaries contingent on survivorship, and a specific set of conditions my grandfather had drafted with his own attorney in 1986. Those conditions, which I had reviewed exactly once in my life, at the age of 22, when my grandmother had sat me down in the estate library and walked me through the document with the seriousness of someone passing on something they considered genuinely important, included a provision I had not thought about in 9 years. The provision stated that a named beneficiary who, and I am rendering my grandfather's language as Reginald described it to me, abandons, through sustained voluntary absence of a period exceeding 24 consecutive months, meaningful participation in the family's shared domestic and social life, could, upon majority vote of the remaining adult family members, be reclassified from primary to contingent beneficiary status, effectively reducing their interest in the trust to a residual fraction, 24 consecutive months. I had been overseas for 22 months at the point of the estate dinner. I had 2 months remaining before the provisions window closed. They didn't wait, I said. They did not wait, Reginald confirmed. The amendment was filed through Hargrove and DeLacy 14 months ago, which was approximately 8 months into your overseas engagement. At that point, you had been absent for 8 months, not 24. The provision had not been triggered. The amendment was therefore not legally executable under the trust's own terms. But they filed it anyway. They filed it with a backdated attestation document claiming the 24-month threshold had been met. The attestation carries your signature. As I said, not your signature. I set the pen down on the desk. How much, I said, does the trust hold? A pause. Reginald Harriet Cho does not pause for dramatic effect. She pauses when she is selecting the precise language for a number she knows will require the listener to sit with it. The primary real property in Westchester, she said, carries a current assessed value of $4,260,000. The associated liquid portfolio, which your father has managed as successor trustee since your grandmother's death in 2011, contains documented assets of approximately $1,840,000. There are additionally two commercial properties in Lower Westchester that I am still having valued, but that preliminary assessments place at a combined $1,190,000. The total trust portfolio, before any legal adjustment, is conservatively valued at $7,290,000. $7,290,000. An interest I had held since the age of 8, granted by a grandfather who had told me, on the afternoon he introduced me to the trust document in the estate library, that the Voss family's purpose was not the accumulation of things, but the protection of the people who deserved protection. He had looked at me specifically when he said it. I had been 8 years old and I had understood, in the incomplete, intuitive way that children understand things said directly to them by people who love them, that he was telling me something personal. They had attempted to remove me from his structure using my own forged signature. I did not scream. I did not allow myself the release of the rage that was present, absolutely present, a structural, load-bearing rage that had been accumulating for months and was now complete in its architecture. I pressed two fingers against my left wrist. I picked up the Mont Blanc. I wrote the figure in full on the page in front of me, and I underlined it once with the precise, controlled pressure of someone who has decided that a number is also a commitment. What does Dr. Velacort's report give us in terms of evidentiary weight? I asked. In a civil proceeding, her report combined with the filing timeline discrepancy and the backdated attestation constitutes a strong prima facie case for fraud on the court, identity theft under New York Penal Law Section 190.80, and breach of fiduciary duty by the successor trustee. She paused again. Depending on how the unauthorized account access is characterized, there may additionally be exposure under federal wire fraud statutes, given that the routing credential used to access your account was transmitted digitally across state lines. Can we prove who executed the access? Theodore, she said, has provided device logs from a network access event that he documented at the estate 11 months ago. He was visiting for a weekend and observed your father using a laptop in the estate study. He noted the date, the approximate time, and the fact that your father was accessing what appeared to be a financial platform rather than his usual email interface. He documented this in a personal journal he has maintained, with dated entries, since the beginning of his observation period. A pause with a different quality. He has been keeping a dated journal for 14 months, Cassidy. Every entry is timestamped by the journaling application's Cloud Sync function, which creates an independent verification record that is not dependent on Theodore's own credibility. I thought of Theodore and his Volvo in a supermarket parking structure, telling me he had been ready for 3 weeks. What do we need next? I asked. I need you, she said, to do something that is going to be uncomfortable. Tell me. I need you to give them what they think they want. For the next 4 to 6 weeks, I need you to behave in every visible interaction with your family as though you are unaware of the amendment, unaware of the account access, and willing to accept the new terms they are preparing to present to you. I need them to believe that the Forbes cover is the extent of your resources, that you are professionally credible but financially dependent on their goodwill regarding the trust, and that you are, at some level, still the person they have always believed you to be, someone who can be managed. I looked at the page in front of me, the figure, underlined once. How long do I need to maintain that? Until I file, she said. And I cannot file until Dr. Velacort's report is fully certified, the commercial property valuations are complete, and I have received from you the certified compensation records, including the equity participation clause details. You'll have the compensation records by Friday, I said. Then we're looking at approximately 5 weeks, she said. Can you do 5 weeks? I can do 5 weeks, I said. One more thing, she said. When they reach out, and they will reach out, I need you to save everything, every call log, every message, every voicemail, every communication in any medium. I already am, I said. She said she knew. She said it with something that, in 6 years of professional association, was the closest she had ever come to expressing approval. The first message from my mother arrived 6 days after the estate dinner. It came as a text message, which was notable because my mother's preferred communication mode had always been the phone call, which gave her real-time control over tone and response, and did not create a written record she might later have to account for. The text message represented, I assessed, either a new tactical calculation or a moment of relative carelessness. I was inclined toward the latter, because the message itself suggested she believed the terrain was already secured. Cassidy, your father and I would like to sit down with you before you fly back. There are some family matters we need to discuss regarding the estate planning that Mr. DeLacy from our attorneys has advised we address. Nothing alarming, Just some updates to the trust structure that require acknowledgement from all beneficiaries. Let us know when you're available this week. I reviewed it 3 times. Noted the following: the use of acknowledgement rather than approval or consent, which was legally precise in a way that suggested Hargrove and DeLacy had coached the language. The characterization of the forged amendment as updates to the trust structure. The word alarming volunteered in a denial of alarm in a message that had not been asked about alarm. The casual, administrative register of the whole message, the effective equivalent of a form letter, designed to communicate that this was routine. I waited 24 hours, then I responded. Of course, Thursday works. Does 2 in the afternoon suit you? She responded within 4 minutes. Perfect, we'll have coffee. I forwarded the exchange to Reginald Harriet Cho with a one-line note. It has begun. Her response: save everything. Respond to nothing substantive without clearing with me first. The Thursday meeting at the estate was 40 minutes long. My father and my mother sat across from me in the estate's formal sitting room, a room my mother used for conversations she wanted to frame as significant but not adversarial, with its 2 facing sofas in cream upholstery, and its coffee table in polished dark walnut, and its arrangement of fresh flowers that she maintained on a weekly service subscription that cost, I had once calculated from a visible invoice left on the sideboard, $312 per month. My father did most of the talking, which was unusual and which told me that this had been rehearsed, that my mother had determined he would read as more neutral, more procedural, less emotionally entangled in the outcome. He had a folder, a thin one, on the cushion beside him. He did not open it immediately. He explained, in the measured, executive language he used for quarterly reports at his firm, that the family trust had undergone a periodic review and that the review had identified some structural elements that needed updating to reflect the current circumstances of the family. He used the word circumstances 4 times in 6 minutes, which I noted because repetition of specific language in a legal or quasi-legal conversation is a behavioral marker I had learned to treat as significant. He said that as a named beneficiary, I would need to review and sign a revised beneficiary acknowledgement document, a routine matter, standard practice for trust administration of this scale. He then opened the folder and slid a 2-page document across the coffee table toward me. I looked at it. I did not pick it up immediately. I looked at it the way I had learned to look at documents I was not going to sign, with the surface affect of someone reading carefully and the internal process of someone identifying every point of structural falsity simultaneously. The document was precisely what Reginald had told me to expect. It formalized the amendment. It reclassified my beneficiary status. It included on the second page a signature line. Take your time, my father said, in the tone of someone offering generosity that costs them nothing because they believe the outcome is already decided. I looked up from the document. I looked at him with the steady, readable warmth I had practiced, the warmth of a woman who is processing something difficult with grace and good faith. I appreciate you walking me through this, I said. Can I take a copy to review? I want to make sure I understand everything before I sign. My mother, who had been sitting with her coffee cup in both hands in the posture of someone monitoring rather than participating, said, Of course, take all the time you need. The ease of her response was the tell. She expected me to sign it within the week. She expected the Forbes cover to have given me exactly enough professional credibility to feel that I no longer needed the trust, or to feel guilty enough about the family's difficult 2 years to accept whatever terms they offered without examining them. She had constructed a psychology for me, the specific psychology of a person who has recently been publicly vindicated and is therefore feeling magnanimous, and she was operating from that construction with complete confidence. I took the copy. I thanked them both. I had a second cup of coffee, and I asked my father 3 questions about the estate's garden, which he answered with visible relief, because the questions signaled normalcy, and normalcy signaled compliance. I drove back to Manhattan with the document in my bag. I photographed every page and sent them to Reginald within the hour. Her response, 12 minutes later: This is the document. Do not sign it. Do not communicate any hesitation or refusal. If they ask, you are still reviewing. Over the following 3 weeks, the family's outreach intensified in the specific way that outreach intensifies when people believe they're close to securing something they want. Prescott texted me twice. The first message was a casual check-in, the surface warmth of a man who needs something and is trying not to appear to need it. The second was more direct. Cass, have you had a chance to look over the trust paperwork? Dad mentioned you took a copy. Just want to make sure you have everything you need. I responded to both with brief, warm messages that communicated engagement without commitment. I saved every exchange with the timestamp visible. Aunt Cecilia called on a Tuesday afternoon, which I answered because Aunt Cecilia was a peripheral actor rather than a principal one, and her calls served, in the current period, primarily as intelligence rather than threat. She spent 14 minutes expressing relief about my wonderful recovery and my incredible professional success, the two narratives running simultaneously in her understanding without apparent friction. And then she said, in the careful, rehearsed way of someone who has been asked to say a specific thing, that she thought it was so healthy that I was engaging with the family again, and that the estate planning process was really a way of bringing everyone back together. I thanked her warmly. I told her it meant a great deal. I ended the call and added it with full timestamp and a summary of relevant content to the file. My mother called on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the estate meeting. This call was different from the texts and the Aunt Cecilia intermediary in the way that a principal actor's direct engagement is always different. It carried weight and it carried intent, and it was not exploratory. She had decided something, and the call was the implementation of the decision. She asked how I was. I told her I was well. She asked about my upcoming plans, whether I was returning to Zurich or considering a domestic base. I told her I was keeping my options open. She said that was wise, that stability was important, that having roots was important. Then she said, in the specific register of someone delivering a conclusion they have been building toward, I hope you're going to be able to sign the trust document soon, Cassidy. Mr. DeLacy has been very patient, but there are timelines involved in these administrative processes, and we don't want to create complications. I completely understand, I said. I've been going through it carefully. I want to make sure I understand every section. Of course, she said, although I will say it's fairly standard. Your brother and sister signed within the first week. This was the piece of information I had been waiting for her to volunteer. Prescott and Lydia had signed their signatures on a document that was founded on a forged version of mine, in a proceeding predicated on a backdated attestation, made them party to the instrument. Not necessarily to the original fraud, which required intent and knowledge, but to the instrument's execution. Reginald had explained the distinction to me 3 times, with increasing specificity, because it mattered for what came next. I'll have it back to you by the end of the month, I said. She said that was perfect. She said she was glad we were in a good place. She said she had always known I would land on my feet, even through the difficult time, that she had never stopped believing in me. I said, I know you haven't. I ended the call. I sat in the hotel room with the phone in my hand and the Mont Blanc on the desk, and the documentation file open on my laptop to the page, where I had been adding entries for 5 weeks. And I allowed myself, for approximately 90 seconds, to feel the full weight of what had just been said to me, the complete, unabridged obscenity of a woman telling her daughter that she had never stopped believing in her. In the same month that she had filed a forged amendment to remove that daughter from her grandfather's trust. 90 seconds. Then I added the call to the file, with timestamp, duration, and a verbatim transcription of the relevant exchange, which I could produce because I had, since the estate dinner, been recording every incoming call to my phone using an application that stored the files in a cloud account that Reginald's office had independent access to. Every single word. Building a wall they could not see. Theodore came to Manhattan on a Thursday in the 4th week, arriving in his Volvo with the cracked dashboard at the parking structure 2 blocks from my hotel at 8 in the morning. I met him at the elevator with 2 coffees I had brought down from my room, because Theodore's preference in coffee is black and specific, and the hotel's lobby bar could not be trusted to produce it correctly. He was carrying a canvas messenger bag, the kind with a buckle closure rather than a zipper, in washed olive canvas that had been with him. I knew, since his compliance years in the 90s, and that had survived, according to him, 17 countries and the Eastern Mediterranean. It was worn at the strap junctions and darkened at the corners, and it looked like what it was, a bag that had carried important things for a long time without failing once. We went up to my room. We sat at the desk and the chair I had pulled from the corner, and Theodore opened the bag and began to set things on the desk with the methodical care of someone who has been waiting for this specific table for a long time. The physical evidence file, as Theodore had constructed it, was organized in a way that I recognized immediately as the product of 11 years of financial compliance practice that had never fully left him, regardless of what he had told himself on the catamaran. There were 14 manila envelopes, each one sealed with a strip of packing tape and marked on the face with a category code in Theodore's precise, upright handwriting, a handwriting style I associated with people who have been trained to produce records that other people will read under adversarial conditions. Each envelope had been numbered and cross-referenced to a master index document, which was itself printed in duplicate, 1 copy in the bag and 1 copy, He told me, in a fireproof document safe he had purchased and installed in the White Plains apartment 3 weeks prior. You bought a fireproof safe, I said. I bought a fireproof safe, he said, without particular emphasis, in the tone of someone describing a routine purchase. I looked at the envelopes. 14 of them, in sequence, on the desk of a midtown Manhattan hotel room on a Thursday morning in early autumn. I pressed the pad of my index finger against the face of the first one, feeling the specific texture of the craft paper and the slight rigidity of the contents inside, the density of accumulated documentation, and I understood, in a way that is difficult to articulate precisely, that what was on that desk was not just evidence. It was the physical, tactile record of 2 years of my life as it had actually occurred, as opposed to the version that had been circulating in Westchester County Country Club conversations for the same 2 years. Both records existed simultaneously. Only one of them was true. Theodore walked me through each envelope in sequence. The first contained the Forensic Document Examiner's report from Dr. Mara Velacourt, 44 pages including appendices, printed on paper that had been certified with her professional seal on every page and which concluded, in language I could now recite from memory, that the signature on the 2019 estate amendment was inconsistent with the known authentic signature specimens provided and consistent with a traced or projected reproduction of a high-resolution digital scan of the subject's genuine signature. The report included 17 comparison exhibits, side-by-side analyses of specific letter formations, pressure profiles, and stroke termination patterns, each annotated in the margins of Dr. Velacourt's printed copy in a red technical pen. The second envelope contained the filing timeline documentation, the original trust document with its dated provisions, the estate amendment with its recorded filing date, and the backdated attestation document with the forged signature, alongside a certified record from the Westchester County Clerk's office confirming the actual submission date, which was 14 months prior to the dinner, at which my mother had formally narrated my fictional addiction to a table of 14 witnesses. The third envelope contained Theodore's journal, printed in full from its cloud-archived source, 112 pages, with the application's automatic timestamp metadata included as a header on each page, confirming that each entry had been created on the date it bore and had not been subsequently edited. The journal was precise and specific and written in the voice of a man who had spent 11 years producing compliance documentation and had never, at the fundamental level, become a different kind of writer. I read 7 pages at random. What I read was not dramatic, it was thorough. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the specific, devastating thoroughness of someone who understood that the power of a document is in its completeness. Theodore, I said. He said, drinking his coffee. This is extraordinary. He looked at the desk for a moment. Then he looked at me with the expression I had first catalogued on the back steps of the estate on the evening he handed me the Pesca Crianza, the expression of a man who has been underestimated for so long that being seen accurately produces in him something almost shy. You kept my receipt, he said. I kept your receipt, I said. The fourth envelope contained the bank's device and routing records for the unauthorized account access, accompanied by a certified forensic analysis from a digital evidence firm that Reginald had engaged, a firm whose senior analyst had produced a report establishing that the routing credential used to access my account had originated from a device registered to the Voss Estates residential internet service account. The analysis included Internet Protocol tracking logs, printed on paper that felt slightly heavier than standard stock, the kind of paper that digital forensic firms use because it scans cleanly and reproduces without degradation in court exhibits. I ran my thumb along the edge of the stack. The weight of it, the irrefutability. The fifth envelope contained the compensation records I had provided. My base retainer agreements, the equity participation clause with its certified valuation, and a letter from the company's chief financial officer, notarized, confirming my role, my tenure, and my compensation structure in full. The equity participation clause, which I had not disclosed to my family, had been valued at the time of the filing, through a preliminary company assessment, at an amount I will state precisely, $412,000. That figure had been growing. The company's expansion had proceeded well. By the time the Forbes article was published, the preliminary assessment was no longer the operative one. Reginald had advised me, for the moment, to let the filed valuation stand as the documentation of record. There would be a time for the updated figure. That time was not yet. The remaining 9 envelopes contained corroborating materials. The communications Theodore had preserved, the Aunt Cecilia letters in scanned and certified copy, the text message exchanges I had saved with timestamps, the call records with their audio files on an encrypted drive that sat in the bottom of the canvas messenger bag, wrapped in a square of microfiber cloth. Theodore had been methodical. He had been methodical in the way that a man who has sailed through an unseasonable storm alone and arrived where he intended to arrive is methodical. Without drama, without announcement, without any of the performative carefulness that substitutes for actual rigor. We spent 6 hours at that desk. We cross-referenced every envelope against the master index. We noted the gaps, the places where documentation was strong, and the places where it was adequate, and the places where it was thinner than we wanted. And we discussed each gap specifically in terms of what additional corroboration was available and whether it was worth pursuing. There were 2 gaps that concerned me. Reginald, when I called her at the end of the day with Theodore in the room, assessed the same 2 gaps and told me that one of them was addressable and one of them was not a gap in the legal sense but a gap in my own comfort level, which was a different category of concern and one she could not resolve for me. Can we proceed without it? I asked. We can file without it, she said. The case does not depend on it. Then we proceed. She told me she would be ready to file in 8 days. She told me that once the filing was submitted, the family would be formally notified through their attorney, Hargrove and DeLacy, and that from that moment the window of their ignorance would close permanently. She told me to use the 8 days to finalize anything I needed to finalize. Is there anything you want to say to them? She asked. Before it files, some people find it important to have said something directly. I thought about my mother's hand over mine at the dinner table. I thought about Prescott telling me I looked tired. I thought about my father looking at his plate. No, I said. There's nothing I want to say to them. After I ended the call, Theodore and I sat for a while in the hotel room with the envelopes back in the canvas bag, and the coffees long finished, and the late afternoon light coming through the window at the angle that meant it was nearly evening. I thought about the estate in that same light, amber through the oak trees along the western property line. I thought about my grandfather in the library, the trust document open on the desk between us, his specific intention encoded in language that had survived him by 35 years and that someone had attempted, with a trace signature and a backdated attestation, to quietly revoke. He would have been interested in this, Theodore said. He did not clarify who he meant. He did not need to. He would have been, I said. Theodore repacked the canvas bag, buckled it closed, and stood. At the door of the hotel room, he stopped and looked back at me with the dry, precise expression of a man who has been called a cautionary tale by people who are about to become one. You know, he said, I have a feeling. I know, I said. Me too. He left. I locked the door. I sat at the desk and I uncapped the Mont Blanc, and I reviewed the master index one more time. Alone, the way I review things I need to be certain of, in the specific quiet of a room where no one is performing anything for anyone. In 8 days, Reginald Harriet Cho would walk a filing into a Westchester County civil court that contained Dr. Mara Velacourt's 44 pages, Theodore's 112 timestamped journal entries, 14 manila envelopes of indexed, cross-referenced, certified documentation, and the audio recording of my own mother's voice telling 14 witnesses at a dinner table that she had called her daughter a drug addict and made no apologies for it. The Voss family was preparing, at that precise moment, to host a celebration brunch at the estate to mark what my mother had described in a group message to the extended family network, a message I had received and immediately forwarded to Reginald as a new chapter for our family. And not one of them had any idea that the only new chapter beginning was the one they did not get to write. The filing went in on a Tuesday. Reginald Harriet Cho submitted it at 9:14 in the morning, which I know precisely because she sent me a one-line message at 9:16 that read, "Filed. Reference number on record. They will be notified through counsel within 72 hours." I was in my hotel room with the Mont Blanc uncapped and a cup of coffee I had not yet touched, and I read the message twice. And then I sat very still for approximately 30 seconds in the way I sit with things that are now irreversible, which is with the specific quality of attention you give to something that has just permanently changed its form. Then I drank the coffee. Then I went to work. The celebration brunch my mother had organized at the Westchester estate was scheduled for that Saturday, 4 days after the filing. It had been framed, in her group message to the extended family network, as a family gathering to celebrate new beginnings, which was language that I had reviewed with the same forensic attention I now applied to everything she communicated in writing. Guest list, as Theodore had confirmed through his own network of observation, included Aunt Cecilia, Prescott and his wife Margox, Lydia, three of my parents' closest social couples, and Mrs. Dorothea Price, who appeared at this point to function as a kind of emotional support structure for my mother in the way that certain people become embedded in family systems, by making themselves available at every significant occasion, regardless of whether their presence serves any purpose beyond witness. I confirmed my attendance on Wednesday morning. My mother responded within 6 minutes. Wonderful, 11 o'clock, we're so glad you're coming. I forwarded it to Reginald. She responded, expected, the timing is noted. Hargrove and DeLacy received formal notification of the filing on Thursday afternoon. I know the precise time because Reginald's process server filed a confirmation of service at 3:47 in the afternoon, and because Theodore, who happened to be driving past the Hargrove and DeLacy offices in Scarsdale on an errand, he had engineered with the casual implausibility of a man who has never been accused of subtlety, observed Mr. DeLacy's assistant leaving the building at 4:22 in the afternoon at a pace that Theodore described in his text to me. As not her usual pace, my mother called me at 6:15 Thursday evening. I did not answer. She called again at 6:41. I did not answer. She sent a text at 7 o'clock that read, Cassidy, please call me when you get a chance. Some administrative matter has come up that I'd like to discuss before Saturday. The word administrative arrived in my documentation file at 7:01. My father called at 8:30. I did not answer. Prescott called at 9:45 and sent a text 11 minutes later that read, Cass, I think you should call Mom. There's something going on with the trust filing. Probably nothing, but she seems stressed. The word probably in that sentence, the specific, load-bearing probably of a man who has signed a document he is now reconsidering, went into the file at 9:56. I slept well. I have always been able to sleep before events I have prepared for with adequate thoroughness. It is the events I have not prepared for that keep me awake, and there was nothing at this point for which I had not prepared. I arrived at the Westchester estate at 10:53 on Saturday morning. The autumn had settled fully into the landscape by then, the oak trees along the western property line in full color, burnt amber and deep rust against a sky that was the particular clear blue that only exists in the northeastern United States in October. I sat in my rental car in the gravel drive for 37 seconds. I was wearing the dark emerald blazer, the pendant, the shoes that were mine. I had the canvas messenger bag, borrowed from Theodore, on the passenger seat. Inside it, a single manila envelope containing 4 documents, selected with the specific economy of someone who has learned that precision is more powerful than volume. Theodore was already inside. He had arrived at 10:45, as arranged, in his Volvo, having been invited separately by my mother weeks prior as part of the family's general effort to demonstrate normalcy. He was the only person in that house, besides me, who knew what was in the bag. I walked through the front door. The estate had been arranged for the brunch with my mother's characteristic overprecision. The dining room table set with the good china, the sideboard loaded with its decorative objects, and supplemented with brunch service, fresh flowers in 2 arrangements. The chandelier from Connecticut, hand-cut crystal, caught the morning light coming through the east-facing windows and distributed it across the cream-painted ceiling in small, moving fragments. 12 people in the room, the social geometry of a gathering that has been organized to feel celebratory and is performing that feeling with varying degrees of authenticity. My mother was in ivory again. A different blouse, the same deliberate palette. Her jewelry was the family diamond on the right hand, the engagement ring on the left, both polished. She crossed the room when I entered and kissed my cheek, and said I looked wonderful, and meant, by this, that I looked like someone she could still manage. Prescott was near the bar cart, the dark walnut piece with brass fittings, in a blazer similar to the one he had worn at the estate dinner, the charcoal with the white shirt. His eyes found me immediately when I entered and held for a fraction of a second longer than social ease requires, which told me that he had spent the preceding 48 hours in a state of managed anxiety and was hoping my presence would confirm that the anxiety was unnecessary. Mrs. Dorothea Price was in navy this time, the pearl choker in its customary position. Aunt Cecilia was in a wrap dress in a deep green that was several shades lighter and considerably less structured than my blazer. Lydia was in a pale gray dress, her expression carrying the specific, compressed tension of a woman who has signed a document she did not fully read and has since been told, by a source she trusts, to be concerned about what she signed. My father was standing at the window that overlooked the back garden, his hands in his pockets, in the posture of a man whose instincts are telling him something his narrative is not yet ready to accommodate. Brunch was served at 11:30. The conversation moved through its social registers with the slightly elevated performance of a group that is collectively managing an undisclosed anxiety. My mother controlled the table's rhythm with the practiced fluency of 3 decades, moving topics, redirecting energy, distributing attention with the calibrated precision of a woman who has run these gatherings so many times that she can do it at a significant fraction of her cognitive capacity while using the remainder for something else entirely. What she was using it for, I knew, was monitoring me for signs that I had received the calls and texts and had understood their implication and was arriving at this brunch in the posture of someone ready to be managed. I gave her nothing useful. I was warm. I was engaged. I asked Lydia about her work and listened to the answer with genuine attention. I spoke briefly with one of the social couple friends about a museum exhibition I had seen in Zurich. I had coffee and a small plate of food, and I did not look at my bag, which I had set on the floor beside my chair with the specific casualness of someone who carries a bag to a brunch because they drove directly from a hotel and it is simply with them. It was my mother who opened the space. She always opened the space because controlling the when of a difficult conversation was, for her, the primary source of its management. She set her fork down at 12:22 in the afternoon, the tines down, the handle at a precise angle, and the table found its attentiveness. I want to use this moment, she said, to talk about something that is on all of our minds. Because I think it's better addressed openly, in the family, than allowed to create unnecessary anxiety. She looked at me with the expression of curated warmth that I had watched her deploy at the estate dinner and at every significant family occasion for 31 years. Cassidy, there seems to be some confusion around the trust documentation. I understand your attorney has filed something, which frankly surprised us, because we had understood you were reviewing the documents in good faith. I was reviewing them, I said, very thoroughly. Of course, she said. I'm sure your attorney advised you. That's perfectly reasonable. But I want to reassure everyone at this table that this is a straightforward administrative process and that we are going to resolve it as a family, the way we resolve everything. Prescott, from his end of the table, in the tone of a man who has decided that confident delivery substitutes for substance, said, Cass, if you had concerns about the trust document, you should have just called. We could have addressed whatever was unclear. There was nothing unclear, I said, a brief recalibration around the table. My mother's expression adjusted, almost imperceptibly, toward the specific configuration of someone who has encountered a response that does not match the script they prepared for. Then I'm not sure I understand the filing, she said. I reached down. I lifted the canvas messenger bag from the floor and set it on the table beside my plate with the unhurried ease of someone who has done this in her imagination hundreds of times and finds the reality of it remarkably calm. I opened the buckle. I removed the manila envelope. I set the bag back on the floor. The table's social weather shifted. Mrs. Price touched her pearl choker. Aunt Cecilia looked at the envelope with the expression of someone who has just seen an object they cannot yet classify. I opened the envelope and removed the 4 documents, setting them face up in a neat row in front of me. The first document, I said, in the measured conversational register of someone presenting information they find genuinely interesting, is a report from Dr. Mara Velacourt, a certified forensic document examiner with credentials from the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, who has provided expert testimony in 47 federal civil cases. Dr. Velacourt examined the signature on the 2019 estate amendment. Her conclusion, and I will quote this precisely because precision is important here, is that the signature is inconsistent with my genuine signature specimens and consistent with a traced or projected reproduction using a high-resolution digital scan. I slid the first document to the center of the table. My father turned from the window. He had been standing. He remained standing. The second document, I said, is a certified record from the Westchester County Clerk's office confirming the filing date of the estate amendment. This date is 14 months ago. At that date, I had been overseas for 8 months. The trust provision that would permit a beneficiary reclassification requires 24 consecutive months of absence. The amendment was therefore filed, and the backdated attestation bearing my forged signature was produced, at a point when the filing was not legally executable under the trust's own terms. I slid the second document to the center. Prescott's voice, when it came, had lost the confident delivery he had entered the meal with. Cassidy, I think you need to slow down and let us explain the context. The third document, I said, without altering my register or my pace in any way that acknowledged the interruption, Is a digital forensic analysis confirming that the routing credential used to access my personal bank account 11 months ago originated from a device registered to this estate's residential internet service account. I looked at my father directly for one moment, quietly, without accusation in my expression. The account still carried your signatory access from 2016. I neglected to remove it. That was my oversight. Using it to access the account without my authorization was not an oversight. It was a decision. My father sat down. He did not choose a chair deliberately. He sat in the nearest one, in the slightly uncoordinated way of a man whose body has made a decision his mind has not yet ratified. The fourth document, I said, is a certified compensation record for my engagement overseas, including a notarized letter from the company's chief financial officer confirming my role, my retainer, and the equity participation clause. The base retainer was $187,000 per year. The equity participation clause has been independently valued. I paused, not for effect, but because I wanted what I said next to arrive in a room that had finished processing what I had just said. I am not financially dependent on this trust. I never was. I stayed in this family's orbit because I believed, for a long time, that the relationship had value beyond its material dimension. I understand now that the people who manufactured the fraudulent amendment did not share that belief. The room was the specific quality of quiet that I had learned to distinguish from ordinary silence over the course of 31 years in a family that used silence as a tool. This was not that kind of silence. This was the silence of people whose narrative has just encountered a structure it cannot assimilate. My mother's voice, when it came, was still controlled. I will give her that. She was a woman of extraordinary composure under ordinary circumstances, and her composure did not fully leave her even now. But it had changed its character. It had become the composure of a person holding a position out of trained reflex rather than genuine steadiness. Cassidy, she said, whatever concerns you have about how this was handled, I think the appropriate response is a family conversation, not a legal filing. We are your family. We have always acted in your best interest, even when it was difficult, even when you were not present to understand the decisions that were being made. I understand every decision that was made, I said. Dr. Velacourt's report covers page 17 through page 31 in specific technical detail. Reginald Harriet Cho, my attorney, has filed copies with the court, with a copy transmitted to Hargrove and DeLacy as a matter of professional courtesy. Aunt Cecilia said, in a very small voice, "What is happening?" Mrs. Price had both hands around her coffee cup and was not touching the pearl choker, which was, I noted, a behavioral departure from her established pattern that suggested a level of disorientation she had not yet processed into performance. Prescott leaned forward with the specific urgency of a man who has decided that volume and forward motion substitute for legal standing. You can't just come in here and make accusations at a family brunch. This is absurd. Dad, tell her this is absurd. My father did not tell me anything. He looked at the table. He had been looking at the table for 3 minutes and showed no indication of diverting his attention. I looked at Prescott with the steady, readable calm of someone who has been told she looks tired at every family occasion for 22 years and has accumulated enough patience to last several additional decades. I am not making accusations, I said. I am describing the contents of a civil filing that is now part of the public record of Westchester County. The accusations, in the legal sense, have already been made. They were made on Tuesday morning at 9:14. I picked up my documents and returned them to the envelope with the unhurried care I use for things I have promised myself I will handle correctly. I want to specifically mention, because I think it is important for everyone at this table to understand, that two receipts are included in the evidence file. The first is a bank record confirming the merchant transaction of $422.16 charged to my account for services rendered by Hargrove and DeLacy. Second is a wine receipt in the amount of $43.72 for a bottle of Pescara Crianza, 2017 vintage, purchased by my Uncle Theodore at a family dinner approximately 7 years ago, and handed to me that evening with the instruction to keep it. I looked at Theodore, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his hands around his coffee cup and an expression of the most concentrated, disciplined neutrality I had ever seen on a human face. I kept it. It is in the file as a dated document establishing the chronology of my relationship with the one member of this family who has consistently told me the truth. Theodore met my eyes. He did not smile. He nodded once with the precision of someone who has been waiting to be accurately seen for a very long time. I stood. I closed the canvas messenger bag. I put on my coat. My attorney will be in contact with Hargrove and DeLacy regarding the remediation timeline, I said. If any member of this family wishes to make direct communication with me, please direct it through Reginald Harriet Cho's office. Her contact information has been provided as part of the filing documentation. My mother said, Cassidy? Just my name. In a register I had never heard from her before, something under the composure, something without the performance layer, something that was, for the first time in 31 years, simply a woman speaking to her daughter without a constructed narrative between them. I did not sit back down. I did not give the moment what it was asking for, which was my continued presence in a space where my presence had been used, for 2 years, as a fiction, and for 14 months as a forgery. I hope everyone has a good afternoon, I said. I walked through the dining room, past the sideboard with its collected objects and its fresh flowers, past the chandelier from Connecticut distributing its fragments of light across the ceiling, through the heavy front door, and out into the October morning, where the oak trees were in full color, and the gravel drive was exactly as it had always been. Theodore came out 4 minutes later. He got into the passenger seat of my rental car without being asked, which told me that he had decided, on some internal timeline I had not been given access to, that he was done spending time in that house under the current management. I started the engine. I pulled out of the drive. I did not look at the black shutters or the cream facade or the wrought iron gate as I drove through it. How do you feel? Theodore said. Accurate, I said. He considered this. That's a good word for it. The civil proceedings moved with the particular velocity of well-documented cases in courts that have seen enough poorly documented ones to know the difference. Reginald filed the supplemental materials, including Dr. Velacourt's certified report and the digital forensic analysis, within the week, and Hargrove and DeLacy's initial response was, according to Reginald's assessment delivered in her customarily three-sentence summary, insufficient and indicative of a firm that did not expect the documentation to be this comprehensive. The trust amendment was voided by court order 11 weeks after the filing. My beneficiary status was formally restored. The backdated attestation was referred by the court to the Westchester County District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal exposure, a referral that Reginald described to me as standard given the forensic finding and not within our control to influence in either direction. My father's signatory access to my account became the subject of a separate civil action, which was resolved through a negotiated settlement 4 months later. The settlement amount is confidential under the terms of the agreement. I will say, without violating those terms, that Reginald assessed it as appropriate given the documented exposure, which is, for Reginald Harriet Cho, an expression of satisfaction. Prescott called me 6 times in the 2 weeks following the brunch. I did not answer. On the seventh call, he left a voicemail in which he said, among other things, that he hoped I understood that he had signed the trust documents without knowing the full picture and that he was not part of whatever decisions had been made, a statement that was partially true, partially untrue, and entirely his problem to navigate with his own attorney, which I had no doubt he was doing. I saved the voicemail. I did not respond. My mother sent me 3 letters. Physical letters, handwritten, in her precise italic script, on the estate's embossed notepaper. The first expressed disbelief. The second expressed explanation. The third expressed something that she called regret, and that I reviewed with the specific clinical attention I gave to all her written communications, and assessed as a document that was not yet free of its own strategic intent, not yet simply a woman writing to her daughter without calculation. I kept all 3. I did not respond to any of them. Aunt Cecilia called once. She said she had not known. She said she would never have written those letters if she had known. She said she hoped I understood the difference between someone who was deceived and someone who deceived. I told her I understood the difference. I meant it. The distinction mattered, legally and personally, and I held it with the precision it deserved. My father did not call. He did not write. Reginald handled every communication with his attorney on the account settlement, and I was not present for any of it, and I did not request to be. What I understood about my father by the end of this was something I had perhaps understood for a long time but had not been willing to state plainly, that the passive allowance of cruelty, executed by someone you love, towards someone you are supposed to protect, is not a neutral act. It is a choice that wears the costume of inaction. And the costume had been on long enough. Lydia called me once, 2 months after the brunch, from a number I did not recognize, which told me she understood that I would not have answered a call from her usual number. I answered because I had decided, before that call came, that Lydia occupied a different category from the others, a more complicated one, the category of someone who had been shaped by the same system that had tried to erase me and had been more willing to be shaped by it, which was a human failure rather than a calculated one. We talked for 40 minutes. I am not going to describe the content of that conversation here, because some things are not forensic evidence and are not instructional material and are not anybody's business except the two people who were in them. What I will say is that when I ended the call, I sat for a long time afterward in the quiet of my new apartment in the Seafeld district, looking at the canal, and I allowed myself to feel the full, unmanaged complexity of what it means to love people who have failed you, without resolving that complexity into something simpler than it actually is. Theodore and I had dinner 3 weeks after the brunch at a restaurant in White Plains that he had been going to since the 90s and that had never updated its menu and had therefore, he argued, achieved a form of integrity unavailable to establishments that chase trends. He ordered the Ribera del Duero. A different vintage, a more recent one, but the same region, the same grape, the same specific intention. He handed me my glass with the specific gravity of someone completing a 7-year sentence. To documentation, he said. To documentation, I said. We drank. The wine was good. It was not the Pesca Crianza, $43.72, 2017 vintage, but nothing was going to be exactly that again, and I had learned enough about the nature of things to understand that this was not a loss but a progression. It is now several months after those events. I am in my apartment in the Seafeld district, at my desk by the canal window, with a cup of coffee that has been correctly prepared, watching the early morning light on the water. The Mont Blanc Meisterstück is on the desk. The canvas messenger bag, returned to Theodore, is presumably in his apartment in White Plains, where it belongs. The dark emerald blazer is on the back of my chair. The pendant is on the desk beside the pen. I have been thinking these past months about what this experience taught me that I did not know before. Not about my family specifically, because the specific dynamics of the Voss household are not a curriculum that translates without adjustment to every situation, but about certain structural truths that I now hold with the certainty of someone who arrived at them through documentation rather than intuition. The first truth is this: silence is not the same as peace, and peace is not the same as resolution. For years, I maintained a managed silence around the dynamics of my family because I had confused the absence of conflict with the presence of health. Silence, in a system like the one I grew up in, is not peace. It is the precondition for exploitation. The people who exploited my silence were able to do so precisely because I had trained myself to hold things without naming them, which is a useful skill in many contexts and a dangerous one in a family system that interprets your restraint as permission. The work I had to do was not to become louder. It was to become more willing to let the truth exist in documentation, in the world outside my own head, where it could not be overwritten by other people's narratives. The second truth: when someone tells you who they are through their actions, and then tells you something different through their words, believe the actions. Every time. Not because people cannot change, but because the evidence of what someone does when they believe consequences are absent is the most accurate data point available about their actual values. My mother's words in every letter she wrote me, in every phone call she made, in every dinner table performance she staged, told me one story. Her actions, documented over 14 months in a dated, time-stamped journal by a man everyone dismissed as the family cautionary tale, told me the true one. I had access to both. I had been choosing, for years, to give the words too much weight. The third truth is about the nature of proof. We live in a culture that tells people in difficult family situations to trust their feelings, to honor their experience, to believe themselves. I believe in all of that. I also believe that feelings, in adversarial systems, are not sufficient. Proof is not about distrusting yourself. Proof is about creating a record that exists independently of your own memory and credibility, a record that does not require anyone to take your word for anything, a record that speaks in a language that systems of accountability were built to receive. The Mont Blanc on my desk is not a symbol of success. It is a tool for creating records. I will use it until I cannot lift it anymore. The fourth truth: the people who are dismissed by powerful systems are frequently the most dangerous witnesses those systems will ever face. Theodore, the cautionary tale, in his 15-year-old Volvo, with his cracked dashboard, and his opinions about monetary policy, and his 11 years of compliance expertise he had never fully left behind, kept a 112-page time-stamped journal that became, in a Westchester County civil proceeding, one of the most comprehensive corroborating evidence documents in a case that involved a $7,290,000 trust portfolio. The family had written him off as harmless because they had confused eccentricity with incompetence. They had confused nonconformity with weakness. They had confused a man who refused to perform their values with a man who had none of his own. He had more than any of them. He had just never felt the need to announce it. The fifth truth, and this is the one I want you to sit with the longest: you do not need to confront people who have wronged you in order to hold them accountable. Confrontation is a form of communication, and communication requires a shared commitment to honest exchange that, in systems built on fabrication and strategic narrative, does not exist. What you need is documentation, patience, the right specialist, and the absolute, unshakable willingness to let the truth exist in the permanent record without requiring anyone's acknowledgement or apology before you act on it. I did not need my mother to admit what she had done. I did not need my father to look up from his plate. I did not need Prescott to stop calling me tired. I needed Dr. Mara Velacourt's 44 pages, Reginald Harriet Cho's Tuesday morning filing, and Theodore's 112 time-stamped entries. The rest was just weather. The canal is bright this morning. The coffee is correct. I am 33 years old, which is young enough that everything I have just described feels, from this distance, like infrastructure rather than history. I built something during the 2 years my family spent narrating my destruction. I built something quantifiable and real and mine. And I documented every day of it with the same precision I had learned, in 31 years of being the Voss variable, was the only form of self-protection that does not require you to trust anyone else. If you are somewhere in the middle of what I have just described, if you are in the silence phase, the documentation phase, or the patience phase, I want you to know that the phases have an end. They have an end that is proportional to the thoroughness of your preparation. Prepare thoroughly, engage the right people, trust the record over the narrative. And do not, under any circumstances, sign anything without reading it with the specific attention of someone who already knows they are not being treated in good faith. Keep your boundaries strong. Guard your peace, and I will see you in the next.